Hey everybody, this is Cameron from MAGA News, and this is our first live video. Just want to thank everybody who has liked the page, shared posts from the page. We only started it last week, and we've already got like 80 likes or so that's pretty cool. I wanted to make this video to talk about something that's been sort of trending in the social media atmosphere for the past couple days or so. And that is the topic of fake news and the whole discussion around what is fake news, what is real news. And it's kind of interesting if you look on Twitter, if you look on Facebook, if you look on Reddit, the discussion around this is really polarized. But it's interesting, you know, I think pretty much everyone can agree that the influence of social media on this election has been unprecedented. It wasn't like this in 2008, and I myself have not really ever been into politics per se. I've always known that it's important. I've always had my eye on politics, from probably since I was in college. But I never really saw the need to participate from the perspective that I always just, from looking at the information that I had, it just looked to me like, it doesn't really matter whether you vote, whether you don't vote. The people who represent the interests of the corporate elite and the political establishment are always going to win. It doesn't really matter what you do. If you vote third party, you're wasting your vote. You're just throwing it away. So that was kind of like my attitude. But at the same time, over the past 6 years or so, I've really started to understand that the only way to really change things is through politics, is through government, is through democracy. Now, that doesn't mean just participating in the normal system as it is going to change anything per se. But I really see more and more that the way to actually change the system that we live in into a form that's best for everyone is through politics. I mean, the only other way is through basically protest, which, as we can see, does nothing. Occupy Wall Street did nothing. The current protests that we're seeing against President-elect Trump are not going to do anything except cause more unrest, violence, and we're already seeing that if you look at all. Don't just look at what's on the TV. But the real point, to bring it back to what I wanted to talk about in this particular video, is the role of social media and the mainstream news. And I followed this election so closely. When I wasn't working or taking care of my son, or helping my wife out around the house, when I wasn't doing things that I had to do basically to maintain my lifestyle and all that, I was watching videos, reading articles, researching everything I could. And the most fascinating thing that I've seen within this whole point, in terms of the context of the mainstream news, fake news, etc., is how watching the mainstream news, let's say CNN, MSNBC, Fox, anything that you're going to see on cable TV, for example, or network TV, as soon as a story would be put out, if you were to go online, you would see this discussion happening kind of behind the scenes, outside of what you would see on TV. You'd go on TV, you'd watch TV, and I don't have cable or anything, but I would watch clips online, and you would see the discussion between the talking heads and the pundits and so forth. But then, if you go online, it's like there's an analysis taking place, breaking down what's being discussed, what's true about it, what's not true. And I'm sure that occurred to a certain degree in the previous election, and I don't know what exactly has changed. I haven't really heard anyone give a good explanation for why this has occurred. Maybe it's just because social media platforms have become even more ingrained in the collective consciousness. They're just even more accepted as a way to communicate, perhaps. I'm not really quite sure why exactly, but so much discussion is taking place online about the election. For example, I was at a client's house uh, before the election, probably a week or so, a couple weeks before the actual election took place, probably 2 or 3 weeks before. And the person I was at their home, and this guy was maybe about, I would guess, 10, 15, 20 years older than me. I'm not quite sure. Probably, totally different generation than I am, older generation. And it was really cool because this person is someone I respect and who has a lot of common sense. They own their own business. They're very successful. And, he was in support of Trump from the perspective that Trump was a conservative, but at the same time, had a lot of, let's say, qualms about, supporting him and everything, and wasn't really sure what he was going to do. And it was really cool talking to him because I would ask his perspective, like, well, what's your hesitation? And I would ask questions. And it was interesting because pretty much everything that the guy said was repeating some kind of negative thing that they had heard about Trump on the mainstream news, for example, CNN, Fox, whatever. So it was really interesting because then I would say, well, did you hear about this? Or did you realize this is what he actually said? If you go back and look at the clip, and I would show him videos, and he was like, wow, this is really crazy. I didn't know this. All I heard was what you hear on TV. And it was really interesting. The one thing he said was, well, I wish Trump would be like this, and there, would say this, and I'd say, that's actually what he said. I've actually been watching his speeches, and that's actually what he's saying. That's actually what he's proposing. So it was really interesting because I was explaining to this guy, I was like, and this is probably, like I said, 3 weeks maybe before the actual election. I said, look, I really think Trump's going to win. I said, I don't know for sure whether he'll be allowed to go into office because I don't know to what degree the establishment will manipulate the situation, in terms of voter fraud and things like that, but also in terms of electoral college, or also in terms of, I really don't know. I thought it was really cool, probably in my opinion, the best quote of this election from Trump was the point about this election will determine whether, and I might be misquoting, so I'm kind of paraphrasing, but he basically said this election will determine whether we live in a rigged system or not, whether we're really in a free society or whether it's rigged. So kind of meaning, the way I took it was, even no matter what happens, we'll get to see, it'll be exposed the degree to which the system is rigged. I mean, Trump went out there and used his business sense, his ability to create a team, his ability to persuade, his ability to utilize the media to push a message, all of that. And it's kind of like he was out there, he's like, I'm going to do my best to win, and then we'll see what happens from there, whether the system is actually rigged or what. So from my perspective, whether you agree with Trump's policies, positions, and so forth or not, the one thing I think everybody can take away is that really anybody can become president. I mean, that's obviously with a caveat. You have to have a lot of money. You have to have persuasion skills, etc. But my point is, anybody from the perspective of it's not just like my old viewpoint when I was younger, which is it's just a completely rigged system. Only the political establishment and the people who are working on behalf of the corporations can even have a chance. Now, we'll see what Trump does, once he gets into office and so forth. So I don't know, but just from what I've seen, he's not. It's easy to be cynical about it and say, well, he's probably just an insider like everybody else, and I think that's true to a certain degree. He is. He's coming from the inside in terms of having a lot of money and success and so forth, but he doesn't come from the political class. He doesn't come from, he's self-funded, so he's actually putting his own money, his own reputation on the line to do what he's doing. And if you look at the news with an objective eye, and when I say objective, I'm not coming from a conservative background. I've always considered myself more of a progressive. I definitely believe in equality. I want a world that's best for everybody. So this isn't coming just from a perspective of I define myself as a conservative, so I'm supporting the conservative president. This is the first time I've voted in my entire life. So my support of Trump initially started out as, hey, this guy's really good in business, and I've known a little bit about him from the past, so he at least will represent a success mindset, and I think that'll be good for Americans to start looking at that and realizing, that you can take responsibility for your life and so forth. But then I actually started to listen to him and challenge a lot of my pre-held assumptions and beliefs about a lot of the problems and challenges that our country and our world are facing. And it started to make a lot of sense what he was saying. And you could chalk that up to his persuasion skills. But at the same time, I also was observing the media narrative against Trump. And it's funny because within the media, the mainstream media, you have this kind of myth, I would say, being perpetuated that the media was biased against Trump. I'm sorry, biased against Clinton, rather, biased on behalf of Trump, like as if they helped him in a way. And I do think they helped him, but I think that was more inadvertent than anything. And I think it was more to do with the way the Clinton campaign took in the information and perhaps got a false sense of security. And a lot of people have been talking about this. This is not an original idea, but I do think that it helped in the sense that it gave the Clinton campaign a false sense of security. And I do think a lot of people were genuinely surprised that Trump won. I wasn't. And there were a lot of people who were having this discussion online who were absolutely not surprised at all. In fact, expected it. Scott Adams, for example, Mike Cernovich, Stefan Molyneux, others. I was not surprised at all, and like I was telling that client, as I was talking about earlier, when I was at their house, I think he's going to win. And he was kind of like, what are you on? Like, what are you talking about? He's going to win. There's no way, even though he supported Trump. So I was like, well, I explained to him there's a conversation happening online that maybe you're not aware of, but if you were online and you're from a younger generation, sort of the millennial generation, it's a whole different conversation happening online. So to go back to that point, when I look at the mainstream media versus the conversation that's occurring online, the one thing that really has stood out to me the most from all of this is that point of how biased the mainstream media really is. Now, everybody has a bias inherently. Not inherently. It's an accepted bias. Everyone has accepted biases. And that has to do with a lot of things, stemming back from the time you're in your mother's womb and you're being programmed by your environment. So that's another discussion. But it was clear from this election, I think if you're being objective, if you're looking at both sides, if you're not just watching the mainstream news and just taking it in passively, if you're actually looking at it objectively, it's pretty clear that the mainstream media was very biased. That there was an assumption that Trump wouldn't win, that there was an assumption that a Trump win is a bad thing for America. And we like to say that we have a free press and that it's supposed to be objective and non-biased, but that it clearly wasn't. And I think as people start going back and examining this with an eye to actually seeing what really occurred and not just trying to push an agenda, I mean, you're not going to get any real analysis from the mainstream media. But as people, go and do their own independent examination, if you go back and watch Trump's rallies online and you watch Clinton's speeches and you go back and watch the debates and you look at the media coverage and then you go back and look at archives of what conversation took place online, I think people will start to see what really occurred. But to go back to the main point of why I wanted to make this video right now is with regards to the discussion right now going on about mainstream versus fake news. There's a Chrome extension that someone developed, which is going to allow people to basically install a browser or an extension on their browser, and it will, I guess, give you pop-ups and alerts if you're going to be exposed to an article or some piece of news that's, quote, fake. And I see the mainstream media pushing this very heavily. Apparently some professor at some university produced a list of what she considered fake news. And I think it's very dangerous because people tend to consume media passively and just accept. And that really stems, from what I can see, from our childhood and from our education system. Because in our education system, we're taught, maybe not explicitly, although in some cases explicitly, we're taught to obey authority, that if a person is in a position of authority, that they are automatically correct, that that if information comes from a source that most people are listening to, then it must by default be correct. And I don't think this is something that people do consciously. I think it's something that they do subconsciously or even unconsciously. And yet, if you were to ask them about it, most people would probably say consciously, well, yeah, of course, if it's on TV, if it, it wouldn't be there if it wasn't true. Without realizing that the fact that it's on TV, I mean, you can go into all of the regulation around the FTC, what's allowed to be on TV, the fact if I wanted to start my own TV channel, I wouldn't be able to, regardless of how correct or incorrect what I'm saying is. And so this whole push that we have for labeling some things fake news and some things not, it's not that I'm against people being aware of what's fake and what's not fake. But, for example, when you look at the list that was published, it's mostly targeting right-leaning publications. For example, places like BuzzFeed online are not mentioned at all on the list, even though they're constantly putting out clickbait articles, things that are have hyperbolic titles that are meant to just bring you in when they're not actually true. And I do see that from some of the right-leaning websites as well. But the point is, what is it saying about ourselves as individuals if we're afraid of being exposed to information, a headline that's clickbait or that's incorrect? I think, for one, it shows that the media, and I think on all sides, know people generally don't read the articles. They just post things, or they just look at things based on the headline. I mean, but this is not new. This is something that the mainstream media has been doing since there were newspapers, and probably even before, whatever there was before that. So headlines are what drive news cycles. And I saw this a lot in terms of the sort of cultural, or the meme going around that, Trump represents some form of racism because of his statements that, quote, all Mexicans are rapists, which is really interesting because I remember this was probably the point that a light bulb went off for me personally, because when I first started looking into Trump, it was like kind of curious because I knew he represented success. Honestly, I had a kind of negative opinion about him from what I knew about him on The Apprentice and just general things like that. But I did like the fact that he represented success and business and that sort of thing, and that he wasn't from the political establishment per se. But then I watched one of his speeches where he talked about immigration, and he talked about the fact, and I will admit, as he does as well, if you read his books, he uses hyperbole. He exaggerates. He's not lying, but he's exaggerating for effect, because he's a salesperson. He understands that if you want to get a message across, you have to amplify it in a way where it creates that emotional response within people, so that, and because most people are not making decisions based on rationality, based on common sense, based on reason. I'm not saying it's good, I'm just saying that's what most people are doing. It's the same reason why headlines work, to drive news cycles. It's the same reason why people trust the mainstream media and they generally don't trust anything else. And, there's this idea that people have that you shouldn't believe everything you see online. Just because it's online doesn't mean it's true. Well, yeah. Just because you hear something doesn't mean it's true. Just because an authority figure says it doesn't mean it's true. Just because it's on TV doesn't mean it's true. But going back to that point about this misquote, where, and a lot of people, whenever, if I were to say something positive about Trump or anything, in the past few weeks, people would automatically say, well, you must be racist, or how can you support a racist, because he said these things about Mexicans. And going back to that point, when that occurred, when he gave that speech and he pointed out that, a high percentage of women were coming across the border from Mexico were being reported being raped, and he was saying that, therefore, obviously, we're not getting the best from that country. He said some people, I'm sure, are great people, but, we're also getting criminals and rapists and things like that as well. So we're not just getting the best. We're not getting the doctors and the lawyers, coming across the border like that. Generally, they're coming in a legal fashion, generally. Not always, but generally. but the media took that and twisted it. And there's a great video by Stefan Molyneux called The Untruth About Donald Trump, where he goes through all of the iterations of the misquote and how it developed into suddenly Trump said Mexicans and even Mexican Americans are rapists and all this stuff, which was far removed from what he actually said. And I'm not defending the statements that he made originally, even though I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with them personally. But the point is, it wasn't at all what was basically reported. And so what I see is there's this manipulation pattern that occurs with the mainstream media. If anybody comes up to challenge the establishment, Trump aside, anybody, Ron Paul, Jesse Ventura, look up Martin Shkreli, the Pharma Bro guy who, bought that drug and jacked up the price and was suddenly like demonized by the media for representing corporate, pharmaceutical greed. The guy was doing it to make a statement, and actually it wasn't actually hurting anybody. If you go and look at how he actually did it and what he did and what his company was doing, he's actually a really interesting guy. I don't know him personally, but I've seen his story and I've looked at both sides, and it's actually quite interesting what he was doing. But the point is, the media, if someone challenges an establishment, any kind of point in the establishment, the media will then demonize that person. They'll twist what they say, and they'll produce articles, which they'll then use as sources, as proof of what, the wrong things the person did, even though the original article was perhaps biased. You see it happening right now with Steve Bannon and Senator Sessions and basically all the folks that Trump is putting forward. But what's always interesting to me, because I'm new to a lot of the details of politics. I've always been interested in well, not always. I've been interested in politics for a long time because, as I said, I've seen it as the solution, or one way that a solution will be implemented towards creating a better world. But I've never really been interested in the minutia and the details of politics. And so, looking at things now, I start seeing like, okay, they're attacking this person. They're saying this person's a racist or this person's a sexist or whatever it is. But then you go and look at, well, what have they been calling this stuff out equally on all sides? For example, with that case with Martin Shkreli, the guy who jacked up the price of that drug, again, to make a statement about it. And actually, well, I'm not going to go through all the details of it. Go look him up. You'll be very surprised. But the media blew this whole thing out of proportion and, was like, so this was corporate greed and how unacceptable it was. But yet, how often do you hear them really talking about the medical industry that is, to use hyperbole, basically raping people and jacking up insurance costs? When you look at that whole industry and how messed up it is, why is that not a constant source of news? It's only a source of news when it fits, when it's able to be used in a way to actually lock people down more into an acceptance of the system as it currently is. So anybody who actually challenges it suddenly becomes demonized. And I'm not saying everybody that the media talks bad about is a good person, and it's the opposite. But the more and more you start looking into these things, you start realizing most of the time it is. So this whole meme that we're seeing right now of fake news is quite interesting. From my perspective, it's a projection. It's the media, which is the mainstream media, which is actually in the business of manufacturing information and, quote, news in order to manipulate public perception around events, around policies, everything, to basically manipulate your position. This is why it's called television, because it's telling you a vision, it's telling you what to see. So they're in the business of creating and altering perceptions to drive a certain picture. That is fake news. And there's so many cases. I mean, recently during the election, or after the election, for example, CNN was caught using one of their cameramen. You can watch the video, it's online, where the news anchor is interviewing on the street a protester who is talking about, Hillary should be in office and we should protest Trump and all these things, and he's really passionate about it. And then the guy who's back in the studio says, oh yeah, thanks for that interview. I recognize that guy. He's one of our cameramen. I knew him back in Chicago or wherever it was. And you could see the anchor who was there on the scene start to get really nervous, like, oh, this stuff happens so much. I mean, there's so many examples during the election, for example, during the debates, rather, where the CNN was caught coaching their focus group, where you hear Hillary talk, and then give a certain talking points, and then you hear kind of almost like under their breath somebody repeating what she's saying, and then it cuts live, and that the news anchor or the reporter is finishing their sentence, and then you see the person who's supposed to be an undecided voter repeating exactly what she just said. So it was clearly being used to manipulate public perception. And there's a lot of discussion about how the polls were manipulated in order to suppress, voter turnout and so forth. And I think that had a lot to do with having the opposite effect, actually having people, Democrats and so forth think that, hey, we got it in the bag, no need to do anything. And for example, you didn't really see Hillary campaigning heavily in some of those states that Trump flipped into red, like Michigan, for example, because they thought it was going to be no big deal. It was going to be easy. So, just kind of to wrap this up, the real interesting thing that I see going on right now is this whole discussion around fake news. If in a world where people have the ability to think for themselves and to read and to evaluate things objectively, fake news is a non-issue, because you could simply look at it, read it, look up the sources, etc. for yourself. The only time it's an issue is when people can't think for themselves. Their education levels are actually not effective. See, we're not educated. The school systems do not educate our children. It's a lie. They're teaching our children to read enough to be able to take in information, but not enough to think critically about it. So they're teaching our children what to think, not how to think. Okay? So you learn to read, you think you are literate. But the fact is, you're just learning enough. It's like if you've ever had an animal, a pet, or a young child, for example, who is not yet verbal. You can't communicate with them in the same way you can a fully mature adult. They don't have that ability yet to understand what you're saying and respond. And I think that the mainstream media, which is really the corporations and the powerful elite behind them, know that the majority of people cannot think effectively. They can't read effectively, so they keep things at a certain level. And I mean, it's also perhaps deliberate, because the education systems are set up in such a way that it educates people to that level. Most people stop learning to read around third grade. So you're not really advancing your ability. And I know, because I work for an education company. We test people, doctors, lawyers, people who are very successful, or not, well, successful from the perspective of they make a lot of money in the system, like doctors and so forth. And we test their reading skills outside of their field that they practice within, and they read like a third grader. Barely, or at the very best, lower high school level. And that's across the board. And people with PhDs, I've done it over and over and over. You'd be surprised. So the education levels are not effective. And that's the only time when fake news is going to be a threat. So if you're sitting around in fear that, you're going to read something or hear something that's going to influence you, what does that imply? It implies that you don't have the capacity, or at least you don't trust yourself, which means you don't have the capacity to actually evaluate things objectively and not be influenced. So the only people who are afraid of being brainwashed are the people who are really brainwashed. And so I think what we're seeing right now with the mainstream media pushing this anti-fake news agenda is they're saying to the sheep, don't listen to anybody else but us. CNN even did a piece, like a month ago or so, saying don't read WikiLeaks. It could be illegal. We're the only ones who can tell you what's in the WikiLeaks. So if you want to know about WikiLeaks, you got to come to us and we'll tell you what it's really saying. I mean, that's some 1984 Orwellian shit, if you ask me. It's funny because I would say the one book that had the most impact on me growing up was 1984, and I read a lot when I was growing up. I read Dostoevsky. I read, when I was young, not fourth grade Dostoevsky, but middle school, I was reading that kind of stuff. And I read a lot of science fiction, but a relative gave me a copy of 1984 when I was in sixth grade, I think it was, and suggested to me to read it, and it was the most eye-opening thing. And it was, at the time, obviously, I was like, wow, how crazy would it be to live in a world like that? But then you realize that is the world we live in. It's just everything's designed in a way that you still have a certain level of comfort, so you never question it. Of course, that's not true that's not a reality for many people in this world. If you're watching this video, you have a comfortable life, most likely. You are the elite. If you're watching this video, if you have internet, if you have electricity, you are the elite. And see, this is the biggest thing that people need to realize, is that we actually have the power to change things in this world. Yeah, you don't have billions of dollars like Donald Trump, but he didn't have billions of dollars when he started either. Yes, he did get a loan of like $1 million from his dad when he was younger. But he developed that, he applied the principles of success to be able to multiply that into the success that he has now. It wasn't given to him. And I know a lot of people like to act like that it was just given to him, but it wasn't. There's a reason why he's at the position he's at in life, and there's a reason why he was able to win the election, because he applied those same principles. That's something that I'd like to get into in another video, is those principles that he applied. But you can read about it, for example, and there's a book called MAGA Mindset by Mike Cernovich where he discusses that point. But the real point is that what people need to realize is that, again, if you're watching this video, if you have internet access, you are the elite. To think that the elite are in control of this world and not realizing that you are that. If you can read, if you can think, if you have running water. I mean, I used to live in South Africa, and I saw, we would go and take trash to the, what do you call it, the landfill every week or so. And I remember going up to the top of the landfill. It's this gigantic, multi-acre complex. We drove up to the top of the trash heap, which was basically a small mountain. And I kind of had to do a double take, because I saw these kids running around. And then I realized there was these structures, almost like houses, built out of trash. And there were children running around playing in they lived in the trash. They had houses made of trash, and flip-flops were made of trash. It was ridiculous. So when I say, if you're watching this or if you're on the internet, you're the elite, I'm saying there's people in this world who have basically nothing. Those people are probably not going to be able to make a difference in this world. But one of the other challenges is that even people like us who don't have to necessarily worry about our survival in every moment, we still have a lot of challenges, because we don't have, for example, we still have to go to work. We still have to labor to make money. The thing about the elite is that they don't have to physically labor for money. And I don't just mean physically labor as in work in a field. I mean, they don't even have to go to work, and they still have money. They have so much money coming in every month, every day, that they could do whatever they want. This is partly how the elite are able to be so creative, because they don't have the same pressures that most of us have. But that can't be an excuse, because if we're going to change the world so that future generations, our children and our children's children, for example, don't inherit the same problems in the same world that we live in, somebody's going to have to step up. Somebody's going to have to do something differently. And I think, from what I've seen, Trump getting into office is a step in that direction. Yeah, he's not just like all of us. He's not middle class, so he doesn't have the same pressures. But he is showing that you don't have to be beholden to the political establishment in order to get into office. I think things are so severely corrupt in our government that a person like myself or anyone else watching this would never stand a chance. That's why Jill Stein, Ron Paul, Gary Johnson, these guys never stood a chance, because you have to be tough as hell. You have to really be specific and effective to get through the corruption that's in there right now. And I do think that Trump's going to, like he said, drain the swamp a bit and make things a little bit easier. We'll see what he does. I'm not going to put my trust or hope, but I do think that it's going to make things a little bit easier. But the biggest mistake that all of us can make is to think, well, Trump's going to take care of everything. That's the same mistake that the people who voted for Obama, of which I didn't, but the people who voted for Obama did the same thing. Oh, Obama, we got our first black president. Everything's going to be changed. It's better now. we don't have to do anything. And then he authorizes, well, he didn't authorize it, but it happened under his watch. Mass surveillance programs, it happened under Bush as well. Mass surveillance, you know, president authorized drone assassination strikes, like ridiculous stuff that now Trump is inheriting, you know. And if you're afraid of him, well, I mean, it happened. It didn't happen because of him. It happened because the president before him and before him and so forth authorized these things. So this is what happens when we don't hold government accountable, when we don't take responsibility, when we only focus on our own individual lives and our own little individual things. These are the kind of things that occur. And so I'll be talking more about this point, which is the individual versus the collective, or the individual and the collective, because there's the individual and then there's the collective. But if we are going to make a difference in this world for the betterment of everyone, we can't think only in terms of the individual or only in terms of the collective. We have to consider both, because no man is an island, and yet the rights of the group should not supersede the rights of the individual. So there has to be a way to integrate those two, right? But that's a topic for another discussion. So I appreciate everybody watching the video. Like it, share the video, and I'll be doing more of these as we move forward with MAGA news, because there is going to be a lot of changes occurring in the world very shortly. You can't trust the mainstream media. You can't trust everything you see online either, but you can trust yourself. You can be honest with yourself when you're reacting to something, when you're making a decision emotionally. You have to be able to stop and slow down and breathe and say, okay, I'm reacting here. What's going on? Let me look at the thoughts I'm having. Where did they come from? Why am I making these assumptions? Why am I making this decision? Like, what is my thought process really saying? Like, why am I thinking these thoughts? Are these me thinking these thoughts because I'm being objective and I'm thinking critically, or is this coming from assumptions I've made in the past, or things I've seen, or maybe things I've been exposed to that I wasn't even aware of? You have to really start taking responsibility for your thoughts, and it's not easy. It's very challenging, and it will take a process over time, but we can support each other to do that. Right? So that's, again, another discussion for another day. This is just the first video from MAGA News, so thanks for watching, and we'll continue to be putting out more information. Okay, take care.